Commentators and analysts have praised Latin America's recent economic performance as the crisis that didn't happen, meaning that Latin American countries were able to weather the global storm without major upheavals or shocks like currency crises or bank collapses. Indeed, this crisis, unlike others in recent past, did not originate in Latin America, a fact that speaks to the progress the region has made in pursuing sound macroeconomic policies. While the global crisis may not have resulted in financial doom for Latin America, it had a serious impact on international trade. Estimates for global trade in 2009 show a 16% volume contraction and a meager growth of 1% for 2010. Overall figures for the region show Latin America's exports dropping 31% in the first half of 2009, while the value of imports decreased by 29% according to ECLAC figures. Every country in the region has seen a substantial drop in foreign trade, yet those whose main trading partner is the United States, specifically Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, some Andean countries, have seen the sharpest drops. As in other parts of the world, the crisis has raised important questions about the role of foreign trade in Latin American economies, what policy options governments ought to pursue in order to address some of the imbalances and vulnerabilities in the region's commercial profile, and what role for Latin America in proposed changes to the international financial architecture. For instance, what role is there for interregional trade throughout Latin America's existing regional integration schemes? Can these groupings become effective policy instances and instruments for assuming a more proactive role in the new international financial architecture? To address these questions, we have assembled a group of experts from throughout the region who will be examining the current state of Latin America's regional integration and some of the policy issues confronting governments in this regard. This conference and event is co-sponsored by the Red Mercosur Research Network, of whose Andres Lopez is director, and is part of a project of the Latin American program that examines the political economy of trade throughout the region. The project is supported by grants from the Ford Foundation and the Andean Development Corporation. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors at Red Mercosur, in particular its director, Andres Lopez, for all the hard work that went into putting together this event, as well as the staff of the Latin American program, in particular Nikki Nichols, whose support was crucial in assembling the group of scholars that we're seeing today. Red Mercosur also wishes to thank the support of Canada's International Development Research Center. So without further ado, we'd like to invite our first panel and begin our discussion of evolution of the economic crisis and Latin America's regional integration groups. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I prepared a presentation that is not focused in the short term, but rather tries to discuss some issues related to the present state of Latin American regional integration in a broader perspective, and that's the purpose of the presentation. I think I won't take more than 20 minutes so that we can have time for discussion afterwards. The structure of the presentation is as follows. First, I will very rapidly go through a brief, but very brief, historic overview, essentially to tell a couple of stories that will be of some interest later. Then I will try to make a summary of what the state of the game is today as I see it. Try then in the next 2 points to account for that present state of the game, looking first at the external environment or external conditioning factors, and then looking at some endogenous factors and constraints, in particular to deeper integration. Then a couple of points to illustrate the previous 2 points dealing with Argentina and Brazil, and first raise some conclusions which may be of some policy relevance for the discussion that I hope this seminar will open up, or will rather continue. The analysis of, or the conceptual organization of how regional integration has proceeded in the last half of a century in Latin America has in the last 15 years has developed around the notion of open versus, or rather new versus old regionalism. I think that's a pretty accurate description of how models of regional integration have appeared throughout history. But yet I think that when you look at that process from a historical perspective, you can clearly distinguish two big models, but three great phases in the process of regional integration in the region. The first one I would call the Grand Design, which was the period of the 60s, particularly when regional integration was basically taken as a component of a development model based on import substitution industrialization. This was a period of big ambitions but very modest results. There is an extensive literature on accounting for, on the one hand, the reasons for the big ambitions, and on the other, the factors that lie behind the modest results. In a review we made of the literature for a paper that we prepared for the Inter-American Development Bank earlier this year, we went through a lot of literature from that period of time, and it was very interesting because we found that, as a matter of fact, very little or very few new things have been said in recent years. Of course, there is always new ways to put old things, but essentially we tend to forget what others have written before as time goes by. And then I found a nice paper by two historic old economists, Javier Villanueva in Argentina and Fuentes, which I think is a Colombian, that gave three explanations which sound very obvious for the big ambitions and the modest results, that were the cross-country heterogeneity across the region, the changes in the external environment, and the tensions between local interests and collective needs. I mean, if we use these three set of variables, I think we can easily understand what has been going on for most of the period and where we stand today. I'm just making this statement not to appear, as we many frequently do, in our discipline, that we are just discovering again what has been said in a different way many years before. The second phase, or the second period, I would say is the period of what I call the crisis and transition. Crisis and transition in the 1970s, but basically in the 1980s, in which the dominant focus of regional integration efforts was on pragmatism and defensive responses. The basic idea was to scale down ambitions for regional integration. If you go through all regional integrations agreements throughout this period, you will find out that all of them scale down in what they are putting forward as their goals, either on the basis of a pragmatic approach or on the basis of a defensive reaction. It's a general trend towards bilateralism and so on. And finally, the third period, in which regional integration was basically seen as an instrument of structural reform, in which economic integration was a part of broader trade liberalization programs and instrumental to these trade liberalization programs. And it was also general to most trade agreements, be them South-South, such as Mercosur, be them the most typical feature of this period, which was the emergence of North-South FTAs. Within this broad framework, what are the major factors that come out to the picture today? Of course, you have to make a selection of issues. There are many issues to point out, but I will point out 5 which I think are representative of the current state of the game. The first one, which I think is interesting to point out, is that if we look at bilateral trade relations in Latin America, the vast majority of the bilateral trade relations have shown and show significant increases in trade intensity indices. That is to say, trade intensity among the countries of the region have increased substantially, and we will see a bit more about this in the next picture. The second point I want to stress is that a large share of tariff items and exports are traded currently tariff-free, and an even higher share will be traded tariff-free in 2015. However, there has been very modest progress in non-tariff measures and non-border issues in most of intra-Latin American regional integration or trade integration agreements. A feature that has accompanied this evolution of this performance has been the famous spaghetti bowl. And the final point I want to make out is that the old debate between FTAs as opposed to customs unions is no longer policy relevant. Let me briefly comment on this or show some evidence of these 5 points or comment on each of them before we go into the next 2 points of the presentation. This table is just a calculation of the evolution of bilateral trade indexes across or between pairs of Latin American countries. The trade intensity index is measured as the share of exports of one country in its total exports as a proportion of the participation of the importing country in world imports. And this index, which shows these figures are changes in intensity indices. That is to say, they show whether the intensity of trade has increased or not. And as you can see, all the pair of relationships that appear in the dark color, they show positive shifts, whereas there are a couple or a few of them which are in a clearer color. I'm daltonic, so I can't say which color they are, but in a very few show a reduction in trade intensity indexes. It's interesting to see that in the case of Brazil, the trade intensity index has increased as a market as well as an origin of exports, as you can see in the horizontal axis and then in the row and in the column. So the point is that trade intensity in these 40 years has experienced an increase in the region, and that's an empirical fact. The second point I want to just show a bit some figures about. This is a table that was prepared by a report issued by the Latin American Integration Association on convergence among regional integrations agreements in South America. And what this table shows is the share of concessions offered and concessions received that are tariff-free. And the shares are expressed in 2 ways: as a share of tariff items, which are the bold numbers, and as a share of total exports, which are the non-bold numbers. As you see, there are here 2 big or 2 areas in which by 2010 there is a high share of trade, be it measured as number of tariffs in the total tariff schedule or as trade as a share of total trade that has a very high share of tariff-free trade. If we move into 2014, that share rises substantially for all regions due to the commitments already undertaken in the bilateral network of FTAs that has been signed across South America. However, this has been achieved in parallel to very modest progress in the treatment of non-trade measures. I would say that rather than modest progress, one could argue that there has been, in fact, an increase, very clear in some cases, in the use of non-tariff measures, partly due to the crisis of the last couple of years or the last year, but most generally, I would argue due to the fact that tariffs have contracted in the last 15 years. So the increase in NTMs is not just a reaction to worsening economic conditions in the last 12 months or so, but it's a more longer and well-established trend that went pari passu with the reduction in tariffs. It's as if non-tariff barriers have replaced the role that previously tariffs played. This is not new. Most preferential trade agreements tend to, even the multilateral trade system, experience this kind of shift in the instruments of protection. But this is very clear in the case of intra-Latin American trade, or at least intra-South American trade. There is, also the emergence of a clear spaghetti bowl after. I won't just go very fast. I mean, Paolo has a much nicer picture of this than I do, but then this is how it looks, very poorly drawn, plus UNASUR, ALBA, and all the rest, and relations with the rest of the world. So, the fifth point is related to this customs union versus FTA debate. I mean, it is pretty obvious that in the 1990s there was a sort of strategic competition between two models of trade discrimination. On the one hand, it was the model of the free trade agreements, and on the other hand was the customs union model, of which Mercosur, in a way, was its paradigmatic example. My fifth point is that this policy debate, unfortunately, is no longer relevant for the reasons I will try to show in the next 2 points. In practice, FTAs have become the dominant mode of discrimination, and customs unions have not deepened, but rather they have either disintegrated or they are in the process of doing so. So let me now try to account for this sort of picture, first turning to a set of external factors which I think are not the only ones, but which merit being mentioned, and then make some comments on domestic endogenous determinants of this, particularly of the demise of customs unions. As far as the changing regional environment, external environment is concerned, one major fact, I would say probably the most significant environmental fact in this development, has been the emergence of North-South preferential trade agreements, and in particularly the strategy of competitive liberalization sponsored by the U.S. administration after the U.S. government the executive obtained the fast-track negotiating authority with which started this chain of bilateral deals, which was initiated in the second phase by Chile. This was a major change in the environment faced by regional integration in Latin America. The second major environmental factor which must be considered is sort of ideological or ideational factor, which is the end of the so-called neoliberal convergence both in developing and in developed countries in the last 5 to 8 years. This was a major shift in the policy environments in Latin America, not only in Latin America, also in the developed world, and it had an effect on how regional integration and trade liberalization was seen in the region as a whole. And then finally, there is also a third environmental factor which must be mentioned, which is the emergence of China and the Pacific as a factor of a very active actor in international trade, and in particular what this meant for some South American economies which have a pattern of trade which is intensive in natural resources. This new natural resource boom reduced the weight and the relative importance of intra-regional trade, and probably did so on a more permanent basis than just a cyclical movement. When we move into the endogenous constraints, and I want to stress that the external factors, though they are important, they are just the general framework in which they provide just a general framework for what has been going on in the region. My view is that the endogenous constraints to building deeper integration agreements in the region are far more important and more permanent than the external environmental constraints. The first one is pretty obvious. We have been repeating this for decades, but as we repeat it, we forget it after we have said it, and it's related to the constraints that there are on the demand side for integration. And here, the major fact is, in my view, that although trade interdependence has been clearly, or rather, it has been cyclically on the rise, it is still very low and asymmetric to generate incentives for a deeper integration process. And that is a permanent and structural feature of intra-regional trade in Latin America and in particular in South America. The second endogenous constraint that I would point out is not related to the demand side of regional integration, but rather to the supply side. And here again, going to my first slide, I felt as a debt of honor to mention these two Latin American economies that were writing almost 3 decades ago, divergent interests and unsustainable trade-offs among the countries that embark on regional integration. The fact that interests are heterogeneous is not an insurmountable obstacle to regional integration, as the experience in Europe shows very clearly. But if you have differences in interest, what you need is trade-offs. I mean, you need some sort of trade-off that is able to be sustained and renewed across time in order to make the bargain sustainable and possible. And this is something that has not been the case in Latin America, and there are, in a way, good reasons to account for that. And finally, a second constraint on the supply side, which has started to receive a bit more of attention in the last years, but which is also fundamental, and that is the key question of who is going to supply the regional public goods that are associated with regional economic integration, which is not something that can be provided free. And this just to start ending my final section before my conclusions, is giving a closer look to Argentina and Brazil, which are two interesting cases of economic cooperation in the region and economic integration of the region, and particularly in South America. These comments I will make about Argentina and Brazil are based on two reports that we produced for a meeting, a dialogue, an Argentine-Brazilian dialogue that was convened in Buenos Aires in October, bringing together businessmen, people from the academia, and from government to try to assess what are the prospects of bilateral economic cooperation between Argentina and Brazil. I have some of the reports here with me. If some of you may be interested in having a copy, then you can pick it up here. The reports were prepared by the Brazilian colleagues Pedro Motaveiga and Sandra Rios, and in Argentina by Bernardo Kosakov from ECLAC and myself. So this is the inspiration of what follows. When we look at Argentina and Brazil, the two largest economies in South America, on the demand side, the constraints which I have mentioned before in general terms about rising but low and asymmetric interdependence are very clearly shown when we look at trade figures by these numbers showing relative weights of bilateral trade flows for Argentina and for Brazil. It's interesting to see that Brazilian exports to Argentina were the bilateral trade flow that experienced the highest rate of growth in terms of trade shares. Brazilian exports to Argentina as a share of total Brazilian exports increased by 242% since the mid-80s, when the bilateral trade cooperation program was launched until the mid-2000s. However, despite this impressive rate of growth, much faster than any other trade ratio, exports to Argentina are just 8% of total Brazilian exports, 4 times what they were in the mid-60s, but still a small, relatively small share of total Brazilian exports. On the contrary, Argentine exports are exactly a bit more than exactly the double than Brazilian exports to Argentina, and imports from Brazil are over a third of total Argentinian imports. So even among these two economies, that are the two biggest economies, there is a huge asymmetry in terms of trade relative relevance. The new fact, despite this low and asymmetric interdependence, and this is something I'm sure has to be looked at with more attention and detail in the future, is the surge in FDI, in Brazilian FDI, particularly into Argentina, but more broadly into the region. The surge of Brazilian FDI into Argentina has been very significant in the last particularly after in this decade. When we look at the supply side of integration, of regional integration between Argentina and Brazil, first we can have a look at the heterogeneity of interests issue, and here some interesting points also come out. On the one hand, asymmetries among the two countries have grown bigger. I mean, not size asymmetries, which paradoxically have not grown bigger in terms of size and relative size. The two, either you measure it by PPP or by current market exchange rate, they have not, the relative size have not changed very much, but the political economy of both economies has turned increasingly very asymmetric. On the one hand, Brazil has developed more assertive offensive interests in the global and in the regional arena, while Argentina still has, or rather has, consolidated a predominantly defensive agenda. This has turned out into a sort of phrase that is very popular in Brazil, that is the idea of paciencia estratégica. You have just to, this sometime will end. I mean, this is just something that periodically happens in Argentina, and things will eventually change. On the other side, on the Argentine side, what you have is rather a demand for now compensate me for all we have been doing wrong in the last 15, 20, 25 years. It depends on the time frame that suits you best to make the demand to the other part. So basically, we have a huge asymmetry in terms of a strategic focus on the hand of Brazilian foreign policy and trade policy in particular versus some sort of old-style reindustrialization, which is the current policy predominant in Argentina. So this is, again, looking with a glass into augmentation glass into the relations between two countries, how these asymmetries of interests and this heterogeneity of interests has grown bigger. We could go deeper into that and find very clear evidence of how the domestic coalitions and the domestic interests that are behind these projections of foreign strategies have evolved in the last 10 or 15 decades, and how they have translated into policies. And finally, if we go into the supply side, the second element of the supply side, and look at the leadership gap, again, it's relatively easy to explain what has, not easy, but one can understand what has been going on in the region in terms of regional integration, because there has been clearly a leadership gap, particularly on the Brazilian side. And this is not a demand, this is just a description, in my view, or interpretation of the reality. The colleague of mine, which is Andrés Malamud, he uses a phrase which is is Brazil a leader without followers? So it's a leader which must develop those who go behind, and that is a big question mark. And I think that there are big question marks and debates within Brazil itself about how to translate from the imaginary into the real a role of leadership that can only be provided by Brazil, by the way. And this is not a criticism, again, this is just a policy problem. How do you become and how do you implement and how do you develop instruments that can make you a leader when you don't have the obvious resources to become a leader? The second question is, when we look at Brazil again, which is in my view the potential provider of regional leadership at least in this sense, the question whether Brazil will be dragging or rather will be pulling. That is to say, whether Brazil will be a leader by action or rather a leader by, I don't know if by default, by its own gravity force, which I think this is, at least in the internal debate in Argentina, this is becoming increasingly evident. When you follow the internal debate on Argentina about Brazil, the fact is that Brazil is becoming a leader not because what it's doing in relationship to Argentina, but basically because what it's doing in general. I mean, what it's becoming as a source and a reference in the domestic policy debate. And then the final point, which also comes out very clearly in this report, is the role of the private sector. I mean, how the private sector is gradually becoming and will probably become more a driver in setting the agenda for the process of regional integration, because the agenda with currently the private sector, which has offensive interests, of course that there is a private sector that has defensive interests, but the offensive interest private sector is essentially demanding dealing with regulatory and non-border issues, and that comes out very clearly in the debate on Brazil and Argentina relations. So, just to conclude and stay within 25 minutes, my general assessment is that integration in the market integration is much healthier than institutions of regional integration. Institutions have become and are increasingly politicized, and basically they are becoming an umbrella for heterogeneous interests, and just you can make the list. The private sector will gradually bend the agenda towards non-border issues, but take care with, of course you are all conscious about that, but many times when we talk about regional integration, we say, well, okay, it doesn't work on the trade side, but it will work on the energy side. And I don't see any obvious reason why it will work on the energy side, because it's much more sensitive, but much more complex, and therefore I see very few reasons why two countries will get closer in terms of regulatory issues, for instance, in the energy or in the transport side, than what they have been able to achieve in the food safety side. But the pressure is mounting on that side, and that's something that must be pointed out, and I think that will be there for structural reasons, as I've said and tried to illustrate with the Argentine-Brazilian case. And finally, just a final comment that if we are so much worried by and we are, in particular am I, by the spaghetti bowl, as a matter of fact, the key to start to disentangle the spaghetti bowl is few blocks away from this office, to the right and to the left, and I think that that's where most of the responses lie. So thank you very much.
Okay, let me find myself here. Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, which has hosted me previously as a public policy scholar, and it's wonderful to be back here. I'm very grateful to the Latin American program and to Jose Raul. Really delighted to be back. Thanks to all of you. This is a big holiday week for us, and you're troopers. You came out in a town that's increasingly emptying out. I took Jose Raul's title of this event rather literally in terms of talking about the effects of the crisis and trying to tie that in with trade reform, integration patterns as they have been evolving, particularly in this decade. I also tried very hard to complement Roberto's presentation. You don't need to hear, right, two presentations that basically cover the same material. And as a longtime student of political economy, I'm pretty much out on a limb here. And let me tell you why. Students of political economy and professors are, you know, and especially professors of international development also, we haven't had a lot of success cases to point to, and it's rather depressing, right? Success in whether it's defined in narrow terms as development, as rise, you know, increases in per capita income, success in terms of a broad range of other variables of development. And what I'm looking for here is to expand the parameters of success away from, say, the 2 or 3 countries that are usually mentioned in the region. Chile's always mentioned, and that's one of my reference points here in terms of small states. But I'm also bringing in Peru. And what I want to do is raise and put this on the table for further discussion, just to let you see where this is going. I want to raise the possibility of these small open economies, which are just another world altogether from what we've seen with regard to, say, Brazil and Argentina, the 2 heavyweights in South America, right? I want to raise the possibility of these small open economies striking a balance. And the balance is the following. We've seen, as the prior presentation showed, an increase in trade intensity for both of these countries in the region, but we've also seen heavy demand from China in terms of natural resource exports. That's one scenario, the sort of old-fashioned comparative advantage scenario here with regard to exporting to China, you know, copper, tin, or whatnot, and importing, you know, low value-added, light manufactured goods and increasingly higher level goods from China. Both of these have been codified by Chile and by Peru in separate free trade agreements, bilateral agreements with China. But they both had also codified another kind of liberalization in separate bilateral free trade agreements with the United States. This is the famous competitive liberalization that Roberto mentioned, although I would say it's been much ado about very little. In Latin America, the competitive liberalization cases really are just Chile and Peru, bilateral agreements. Colombia's, God knows, as you know, that's sitting like over there on Capitol Hill, whichever way, and then Panama. And I think that's really not going to make it. You know, we're fighting with the Koreans right now over the auto sector. I heard a very, very rosy presentation in Los Angeles 2 days ago or 3 days ago saying that looked really good. I don't know. But the competitive liberalization, basically, with regard to Peru and Chile, was all about services, right? It was driven very strongly by lobbyists in this town, led by the Coalition of Service Industries. They finally, got off their butts and began, you know, seeing the light with regard to the possibilities for service liberalization, or, if you will, the negotiation of free trade agreements, bilateral agreements with these 2 countries that really did take the new trade agenda, services, investment, intellectual property, seriously. what we just saw, it was implicit in the last presentation, is a very strong reluctance by the heavyweights in South America to budge with this new trade agenda to the extent that both the U.S. would like, but also the tone of the discussions in the Doha round. I mean, part of the stagnation of Doha is precisely the new trade agenda versus the old trade agenda, market access, agriculture, and who's going to give how much, and what the trade-off will be in terms of old and new trade agenda. These countries don't have time to sit around and negotiate the old and new trade agenda. And what we're going to do, and I've borrowed from the very recent report that came out, Arturo Porzenkansky, I think, from ECLAC, has written a report, I've got it cited here, The Missing Financial Crisis in Latin America, or The Missing Crisis. So we're going to see how the crisis has hit these two countries, and we're going to see, for one of the first times in my professional career, my graduate studies started in the wake of the debt crisis in the 80s, we're going to see for the first time an amazing pattern where, yes, as I say in the beginning here, the burden of the crisis has fallen on international trade, not just in Latin America. I mean, it's the main phenomenon, as I said, internationally. But we're going to see here something that we rarely see in Latin America, which is that the financial sector holds. And it is an amazing, I think, example of finally reaping some of the gains from liberalization, particularly in banking services, a wide range of broadly defined service sectors that have held their own. We're going to see that the usual suspects, the capital account, international reserves, foreign direct investment. Again, we're going to see for the first time these have held pretty strongly in the throes and in, I'd like to say, in the wake of the crisis, but I don't think we've spent all of our toxic asset reliefs yet, funds yet. So there may be more to come, unfortunately. Certainly financial markets, the stock market is reflecting, a certain ambivalence about just where we stand in terms of, clearly being out of a crisis. So let's turn to some comparative data. Let me make a few further introductory comments for those of you that haven't been following Peru and Chile. Chile is a well-known story. They've been liberalizing since the 70s. The combination of very sound macroeconomic, especially exchange rate management, has put them in a very strong position in terms of international trade. They're very open, but they're very dependent on the external sector. They've had, as I say here, a very proactive approach to trade agreements. I share Roberto's concern over the spaghetti bowl. They have certainly, contributed to their share of it. We'll see that in a moment in terms of all the agreements that they've either negotiated or are in the process of finalizing. And we're going to see here, and I've just taken some, Heritage Foundation, Freedom, survey figures here. Nothing thorough, but, some quotes or insights that support my contention, which I think will show in the data that there is more than one way to skin a cat here. They've liberalized on the old trade agenda with China, and they have liberalized on the new trade agenda with the United States. Is that a perfect outcome? No, it is not a perfect outcome from the standpoint of the multilateral system. Neither would it be particularly positive from, say, a hemispheric standpoint, but from their standpoint, these are price takers. They're not price makers. These are the little guys, right, in the so-called G20 group within the WTO. They really are kind of left on their own to chart a course of reform and integration through both trade and investment that suits their needs. The leadership in South America that Roberto referred to, what was it, Brazil pulling or dragging, that kind of leadership doesn't resonate with these small open economies who don't have the luxury, quite frankly, of liberalizing stabilizing over 25 years. I don't know when Brazil's going to open its service sector. In particular, the simultaneous reform and modernization of services and investment while they are in the context of negotiating many of these agreements. The export-led model is, I've mentioned all these agreements that have been signed just to show how serious these countries are about defending their own economic interests in many markets. Chile has been the one country that has signed free trade agreements not just with the U.S., but with other heavy hitters, India, Japan. In fact, it was these agreements, and particularly the Chile-Mercosur agreement, that I think really scared, finally, the U.S. service sector. They'd been asleep at the wheel, thinking that, a U.S.-Chile agreement was really of no use to them, and then suddenly they see the Spanish getting in there and investing in Chile like crazy in the context of the Chile-Mercosur agreement. Boom, we have 2002, former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Zelek's announcement of the competitive liberalization drive, and suddenly the Coalition of Service Industries felt that it was urgent for us to seal that deal, which we did rather quickly, because Chile was so far ahead, and there was no kind of quibbling over the environment or labor and this sort of thing, the kinds of things that the Colombia Agreement are really being held up by, and all of their agreements have been held up by the Peruvians to a certain extent, but they just basically did whatever it took to get that agreement. Again, Chile's export-led model has been supported by very sound macroeconomic policy, very impressive exchange rate management. Peru's coming along. This is really, I can't emphasize too much, Peru's one of the loves of my life. I've written a lot about it. I'm coming back to it from time to time. I worked on it with Sidney Weintraub in the context of our energy project in the Western Hemisphere, and now I want to come back and look at how it seems to be finally, after proclaiming to want to follow a sort of Chilean path for 25 years, they seem to finally be on that path. They have a ways to go, but they're much more on it than before. And I can't emphasize too much the ability of Peru to negotiate both with China and with the U.S. is something that was, I think, really unthinkable as recently as a decade ago in terms of the technical expertise, the professionalization of the trade ministry, the entire kind of policymaking framework has really, really improved. Okay, so let me say one last thing about Peru. Go back here. There are issues with the exchange rate. I don't want to go into them now, but it is out of all of our regimes of the movers and shakers in the emerging markets where it's a flexibly downward rate. Peru has been intervening a lot, and I would say the exchange rate has been the one thing that they have not been able to really set free. It's heavily controlled. It's far too strong, and they're able to live with it because the magnitude of exports, especially in the demand, I think, from China and other places with regard to raw materials, has made it less an issue. The manufacturing sector is screaming about it, but they're living with it. Okay, so let's start looking at some of the trends. And again, this just came from the ECLAC report. I began by saying that the burden of the crisis fell on international trade. And this is another trend that I'm really touched by, which is that for once Latin America, in the old days, Latin America would be the most drastically hit country. And here we're seeing that Eastern Europe took the biggest hit. And after that, South Asia, and in terms of the developing countries, Latin America has done slightly better than the average of the developing countries. You can see that now we're going to get into the financial side of it in terms of outstanding international bank loans, the developing countries on the whole. took a fairly large hit. Brazil over here, which would be one of the main representatives of Latin America and Latin America more generally, really were in pretty good shape with regard to clearing both the level of the loans and managing these in the throes of the crisis. We can see that the impact of international trade has been a downward force for a drop in GDP. I was intrigued to see that the LAC 6 is what we've got here, the LAC 5, and then the Latin American figures, but Peru would never be included in the LAC 5, say 5 years ago. And I think it's impressive growth rates, the pace of reform, and its macroeconomic stability has now put it in the LAC 5, and we can see that the trade impact of the crisis did really, push. It was a really downward push on GDP. But if we get over here to the other side and we look at GDP growth and investment growth, you can see that Chile is the orange bar, and the hit came mainly in 2006, but through this 2007, 2008, you can see that they were able to really hold their own on the investment front. A lot of those are fixed investments in big, heavy capital projects, but they're doing pretty well. Peru, in terms of GDP growth and investment, if we compare it to the LAC 7, is also doing quite respectably with regard to growth, but also investment is booming. Let's look at per capita GDP. The LAC 7, and this is kind of interesting because usually the first thing to go is per capita GDP, right? Millions of people fall below the poverty line, and these data may be too optimistic. They're very recent, but we're not seeing the usual plummet in per capita GDP. In Peru, which obviously has quite a way to go in terms of raising per capita GDP, it hasn't taken the usual, big slump. Chile has made really impressive inroads in terms of raising per capita GDP. Both have huge amounts of work left to do in terms of distribution and equality, but we're seeing certainly positive trends here, both in the region and in these countries. Here's where you get to the external accounts. And in terms of contagion from the U.S. crisis, this is where Mexico has, I think, really, struggled given its strong levels of integration. Although I think Mexico is also coping with it very well. That's another story for another time. I think Luz Maria is going to talk maybe about that later. But again, here we have, with regard to the external accounts, the current account is in the basement, but the capital account, Chile's capital account, is really quite strong, and it's rebounded from a couple of very rough years. Peru. External accounts, GDP's in the tank, but capital account, and it again is rather the current account's in the tank. Capital account again has held strong. Let's just look at a couple more of the indicators that usually financial contagion just sends into a tailspin. Let's look over on the right-hand side, your left-hand side. Again, this is another way of looking at foreign direct investment. This is the Chile's portion of the entire region, and it's holding firm also in this graph. And the level of international reserves is back up. The ability of both of these countries to rely on international reserves to fend off some of the pressures from financial contagion. For Chile, this is nothing new. For Peru, it's an amazing accomplishment. Brazil has certainly been holding its own by spending down its reserves. We're seeing really a lot of new learning skills, a lot of new policy skills, especially in the Peruvian case. All right, Peru international reserves with the LAC 7, we can see the extent to which they spent them down when the crisis first hit. In the United States, with all kinds of firms and banks being taken over, and we can see that FDI went down slightly, but is holding its own. All right, so coping strategies. Perfect. I'm being given my time. Again, I started out in the presentation. I think what we see here is that they're pragmatically negotiating over old and new trade agenda items within these agreements. Already made these comments, but, prior to the crisis, each had secured market access through an FTA to the two largest markets in the world. And again, for Chile, this is another process and an ongoing pattern over the last 15 years. For Peru, being in the right place at the right time and having market access to these two huge economies is a whole other, kind of phase of this country's development. As I said, they've both agreed to very deep items on the new trade agenda. The Peruvian agreement was mainly about, with the U.S., was mainly about maintaining market access that they had over ever since the Andean Trade Preference Act had been in effect under various incarnations. So that was mainly maintaining sort of old-fashioned market access, textiles, jewelry, this kind of thing, in the U.S. And, of course, the U.S. side was very deep service liberalization. So the China FTA is the old trade agenda, market access, primary goods. The U.S. FTA is really the new trade agenda. Okay, what accounts for this? Now, let me just rush through this. Obviously, the China agreement, we've got complementary endowment factors and the simplicity of these agreements. I mean, the environmental accord in the Peru-China agreement, they kind of pulled out some dusty letter from 2000 that the Chinese signed with the Peruvians over some environmental, agreement concerning mining investment, and that's the environmental agreement. So these aren't, new age agreements in terms of the non-trade issues. They're just complementary endowment factors. They're pragmatic. They lock in market access on both sides. With the U.S., it was the ability and the willingness of these countries to negotiate. Many other countries, Brazil, Argentina, the leaders are not necessarily looking for an FTA with the United States. And as I said, policymakers in both countries are looking to reap the gains of previous liberalization. These are just some of the economic freedom rankings. Chile has really climbed up. It's 5 spots away from the United States. China, one of the deep mysteries is how it does so well with such lousy economic freedom rankings. Another story for another time. Peru's still struggling, but we're going to see here, and then I'm finishing, the doing business surveys from the World Bank, one of the main, I think, one of the most commonly referred to indicators now in terms of competitiveness rankings. And in this graph, bars going down is a good thing. I would just like to point out in the Peruvian case that it has outpaced Chile with regard to protecting investors, registering property, and it has got work to do in other areas, but, we're seeing, I think, some tremendous gains here. This is just propaganda that I copied from the Heritage Foundation, but it does, describe what lies beneath some of these indicators. And in Chile's case, the very, very efficient state of the service sector, the banking sector, finances, and in Peru, a summary that shows that they're really coming along. Okay, so I'm really truly concluding now. These countries have been proactive. They're not sitting around letting the dust settle. Peru right now is finishing up negotiations with Japan. They've negotiated with the EU. Were these proactive approaches in anticipation of, the crisis? Absolutely not. They're ongoing reforms that, for once, interacted favorably, or at least gave them a cushion in the face of a really severe international shock. I would say that in the medium run, this has been a very effective way for these states to counter this crisis. I don't advocate it for the multilateral system or for the regional system, but it could be a way for small open economies that are on the move to get their own reform goals met with regard to the old and the new trade agenda, given the stagnation. I think part of this panel is called the stagnation in the multilateral trade system. So, is it something that would be? Is it an alternative, say, for a Costa Rica? Maybe. Costa Ricans are still negotiating with the Chinese. That's another story also, but. Possibly, it is a path for Costa Rica. Let me stop. I know you're dying for me to stop, so let me end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paola?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation. And thank you to the authors, because I thought I should comment on papers, so I thought I would be reading papers all the weekend. In fact, I didn't. I just looked through the presentation, and now enjoy your presentation here, so I just put together some ideas. And thank you all the persons that are here. It's one of the few times that I'm not the one that has to travel 12 hours to have a discussion with you guys. So if you sleep, please go ahead. I will understand you completely. So I would like to make maybe a sort of summary of what we heard and put it into perspective, and then make two general points. What is interesting is that Roberto's presentation is a presentation that looks at the issue of integration in Latin America, seen from Argentina, from the bottom of the continent. He tried to look out, and the big thing he sees is really Brazil, and then he discussed some things that are interesting, but he doesn't look beyond that. In that sense, the presentation of Carol is absolutely complementary. She looks at Latin America from the US, and what she sees in this huge group of countries, she sees the two good kids of the block. Chile and Peru, the two good scholars that did everything well. So I think this already sets the stage. So I will make some comments on what we heard and then try to fill some blanks that I think have been left out from this presentation. I think Roberto's point is actually quite interesting. He says trade intensity, interdependence has grown up in the last 30 years, in fact, and also in the last 15 years. And really there is an issue, so the demand for cooperation has grown, and the issue is more on the supply side of cooperation and on the asymmetry of interest. And he put the question of whether there is leadership that is sufficient to bring this process forward. I think, so at least this is the message that I get. The message from Carol is also started with looking from the US, like a defensive position of South America to what she called the new agenda. And she sees that the two countries that in fact kind of acceded to this new agenda were Chile and Peru. Then she makes a correlation looking at the fact that these countries apparently has done well through the crisis. Also the data that she shows don't really look at the most recent data. And she makes a point in which she says, well, those countries have been able to reap the gains from previous liberalization and are well positioned to achieve a greater access to the European American markets. Something that she didn't say but is in the background of her presentation, I think is very important, is two things. One is that those two countries have really two things that are important and in common. One is that there are two countries that really make this choice of international insertion based on a grand internal bargain. It's two countries that at some point decided to break away from a history of authoritarianism and protectionism, and so choose this international insertion model. And second is two countries that were that had it easier than other countries in terms of the sustainment of reforms. It's those reforms have been sustained throughout different governments, and it's countries that have been more consistent than, for instance, the countries that Roberto was talking about. And the third thing that she didn't mention is that probably there wasn't a problem of leadership within the sub-region, which in the Andean sub-regions, because the big country of the region, Venezuela, really made a choice that is completely different from the choice that those countries made. So those countries are not relying on regional leaders to kind of provide coherence to their international insertion projects. So I really enjoyed the two presentations. If I step back and I look at these issues, and I will not reveal truth, but rather I would try to put some question for the debate. One thing that strikes me when you look at Latin American integration in the last 50 years is that integration is always or very often a defense, and I talk about regional integration, is always or very often a defensive proposition. It was a defensive proposition when regional integration would see a way to provide economies of scale and compensate inefficiencies from the industrialization, import substitution industrialization period. It was under the old regionalism. Under the new regionalism, it was a defensive reaction to the globalization that was advancing, the US that was putting foot into the preferentialism game, and in the what I would call in the current phase, which is perhaps a new old regionalism, we have a similarity of the two of what happened in the past. At the end of the day, these defensive responses were giving diminished return from scales, and this grand design that Roberto was mentioning, in fact, didn't end up in a grand outcome. So this is what we have today. We're at the threshold of a new phase, so the question is, what is going to come next? Now, that's the first question that I would like to leave on the table. The second point that I would make is, how did we get here? And it seems to me that Roberto's framework is quite interesting. If one looks at trade-offs, really what missed in Latin American integration, at least in this new phase that ended and spanned the last 15 years, I agree there is a problem between trade-offs, but really what was missing was offensive trade-offs. And the countries that had offensive payoffs, not trade-offs. The countries that were looking for offensive payoffs, they didn't look at those in the framework of regional integration. That was the case of Chile and Peru that looked into the US market, and that was even the case of Brazil that completely changed its strategy starting from 1985, for instance, where it started integration with Argentina as a response to the globalization and really started to look at the world, and now Brazil is a BRIC and is really looking at the old world, and probably regional integration is a second consideration. And the other thing is that institutions weren't solid enough. And when I talk about institutions, I'm talking about internal institution and international institution. Internal institutions weren't solid enough to express or to catalyze this offensive interest, and intergovernmental institutions weren't solid enough to compensate for this time inconsistency that all scholars that study regional integration know that materializes, in which costs arise in the shorter term and gains are reaped in the longer term, and so institutions are ready for that, to bridge this time inconsistency. So it seems to me that the regional integration institutions in Latin America didn't do this job, and this is why we have this state of affairs today. So the question is, okay, what is going to be the new grand objective in this new phase of regional integration? Well, this is something that we can discuss. Where is the next big thing for Latin America? I don't have the answer, but probably can be a discussion. But something that could be interesting for me to maybe provide an answer to this is that if we look at the last grand project that the Americas had, that was the FTA. And the FTA was really about reaping some gains that were in a way uncertain. We didn't really know what were the gains from market access. People like myself or others that try to do this big complex model, try to put together some figures which are very doubtful. But at the end of the day, the point is that we were trying to reach some uncertain gains. Where what we have today is we have to wipe out some costs that are certain. And those are the costs of the spaghetti balls. They are very difficult to quantify because they are related to non-tariff measures, asymmetries of rules of origin regimes. Things are really nitty-gritty and difficult to come out with the billion-dollar figure that we have to address with, but they are very certain, and the private sector knows very well about those. Now, it's also true that in these spaghetti balls, one could call it rent-seeking paradise. So the political economy is going to be very difficult in that. Now, this is my reading of what was on the margins of the presentation. If one looks ahead, I would argue that there are 4 issues that one should consider. One is that probably one of the lessons of the financial crisis, or one of the aftermath of the financial crisis, is that we will live in a world where export-led development is going to will have a smaller payoff than it had in the past. So the question is how regional integration would interplay with the overall development strategy in a world where export-led development will have a lessened value. Again, I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important question. The second point is that probably as we get out from the recession and the crisis, well, we will see that the center of the world economy will have shifted towards Asia. In that sense, Latin America definitely has a comparative advantage, but how to reap that is something that is not very clear. And if Latin America couldn't or was not very successful in finding or in institutionalizing ways of doing business with the US or with Europe, which are kind of natural cultural trading partners, well, how to do business with Asia, it's really in cultural terms, institutional terms, is really a big question. Something that is very clear that none of the 2 presenters have mentioned Europe. In fact, if one look at market shares of Europe in Latin America, or the other way around, in the last 30 years, as we did with Robert Devlin in a chapter for the Handbook of Latin American Economics, well, it sees that they really dwindled. So Europe is really disappearing from the map of Latin America, and this is something that maybe we can discuss. The third point is that since Roberto was looking from the Southern Cone and Carol was looking from California, really what we haven't seen in the presentation is Mesoamerica, and especially Central America and Mexico. And there are, I think, important things that one can draw when you look at Central America. For instance, Central America was really the trigger of this competitive liberalization strategy, and really the moment where the north and the south of the continents started to drift away. But Central America closed a very ambitious deal with the United States, something that is very relevant in terms of market share because the United States absorbed 70 or 80% of export of those countries. But what we know is that trade or a trade agreement is a step in the right direction, or at least we believe so, but is a step that will not produce gains if those countries don't have like a complementary domestic strategy. And what strikes me, and I'm coming back from Central America where we had a discussion with very informed people about regional integration, nobody mentioned CAFTA implementation. The CAFTA implementation is outright not on the top of the policy agenda in Central America. And so I think this is very telling on how Latin Americans, they sign these trade agreements, but see, if you sign a trade agreement and you have a grand vision on how this will fit into the development strategy, well, you will end up not reaping the gains that you might have signed for. And last point, we are here, and as I didn't exactly understand if the answer was in the IDB or in the White House. I'm not talking
Congress. Congress.
Between Congress and the White House. Okay, so that's and that's exactly my point. Something might be changing in the U.S. We might, if we want to read the news of the weekend, we might be very close to a deal between the White House and Congress on the healthcare reform. This will be an historical moment in the U.S. And in the trade corridors of Washington, really, when one was asking why trade is not a priority, why Latin American trade is not coming on the top of the policy agenda, well, the response was because you don't want to touch anything that can mess around with the very complicated political equilibria that the White House and Congress are entangled with for the healthcare reform. Now, if this is addressed, maybe those, let's say, general equilibrium political economy effects might change the picture. And in fact, it's very telling that Senator Max Baucus just a few weeks ago started voicing his concern that trade is not on the agenda of the administration. But then the question, if the U.S. will move again, and President Obama started to hinting at that. Well, he started to hint at that when he went to Asia, and he talked about the Trans-Pacific trade agreements. And it seems to me that when President Obama went to Latin America for the Summit of the Americas, trade was not very high on the presidential agenda. So just to wrap up, if the U.S. moves and start to give trade a bigger priority, where does Latin America fit into this? So it seems to me that, just concluding, this brings back to one of the points that Roberto was making, that if we don't know what is going to be the next big thing for Latin America, maybe we have to look into the house, and maybe the next big thing should be in our house. It should be into the countries of Latin America, and try to find out what would be the next big internal driving forces that will push Latin America towards a more aggressive and forward-looking and sustained strategy for international insertion. So those are the comments I could come out with during my weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Well, thank you, Carol. Thank you, Roberto. And I think we can extend the end of the session by 5 minutes, or so to pick up some questions from the floor. So, please.
Is this on? Yeah. Cindy Arnson from the Latin American Program. Thanks to all of you. I have it's very much part of the dominant paradigm now to see a decline of the United States as a global economic power and the decline in the importance of the United States for Latin America. And I was wondering if any of the panelists could reflect in general, apart from Mexico and Central America, the overall importance of the United States relative to other countries in the region and relative to China. Where exactly does the United States figure in the various trade partners of the entire region? And do the figures bear out the characterization of the United States as a declining influence?
One by one?
Hi, Paulo Sotero from the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. Just one thing, Paulo. When you mentioned Europe's disappearing from the scene, I'm not sure in terms of investments, because European investments are sharply up, at least in Brazil that I know of. I'd like to have a clarification. Is that, despite that event of more European investments, trade is still going down?
We can have one more question. Well, then, please.
Oh, sorry. It was very briefly. First, the question about declining U.S. influence. I think that all the debate about declining U.S. influence is a bit overstated. In my view, of course, it essentially depends on what is the time frame you are working with. I mean, if you are talking about 50 years, maybe that's a relevant issue. If you are talking about the next decade, I think that, of course, there is a change in international balance of resources, but I wouldn't call that a decline in the role that the United States has in the global scenario. It still is the only country that can provide some global public goods like leadership, in my view. Less than in 1947, but still it is the only one. So this in general. In particular, when you look to that question from Latin America and from the South, in particular, I see clearly an increase in the trade relevance of China, but again, the initiative is on the U.S. side. Carol said before that there was not much done about competitive liberalization in practice by the United States. But the point about competitive liberalization and the point about U.S. policy initiatives, particularly in the trade realm, but not only in the trade realm, is not what it does, but what it's prepared to do. And since the United States has offered the possibility of considering preferential trade agreements, that offer by itself was a paradigmatic change on the way in which the rest of the region set their own trade strategies. So, taking this idea into your question and going to my final point about where the solution to the spaghetti bowl lies, I think that the initiative and the influence that policy initiatives have coming from the United States are still very relevant irrespective of changes in the international and in the regional scenario.
Yeah, I think Paolo's going to answer the question about European ties, but let me just add just a couple of things to what Roberto just said to Cindy's question. To answer Cindy's question, I think that I have been studying the differences, say, between the China-Chile, China-U.S. FTA and the Peru-China, Peru-U.S. FTA. And what comes out there is, I think, reflective of exactly what Roberto just said. The U.S., I don't know, let's just say in the new millennium, in this decade, the U.S. has not really provided the kind of leadership that we've seen, at least foreign economic policy leadership that we've seen prior to that, right? With regard to trade, we were instrumental in closing the Uruguay round, the debate over to create the World Trade Organization, and we're really just a shadow of ourselves with regard to trade policy. And competitive liberalization, I think, was the attempt of Zellick to, leave a footprint, have some kind of foreign economic policy. It's really the only concrete one, I think, that came out of the last 8 years. On the financial side, our legacy is devastating, right? I mean, it was anything but a leadership role, and the rest of the world is suffering for it. However, we haven't been providing the public good of leadership, but we still are the hegemon, like it or not, right? I remember in the 80s when I was in graduate school, all these books, The Rise and the Fall of the U.S., Pack It Up, Ship It Out, Forget About It, Just Cut Your Losses and Shrink Down and Be Second Rate. And we had a huge resurgence, an amazing restructuring in the 90s like we've never seen before. A lot of people, at least on the Pacific coast, are saying, that we could be in for another amazing wave of innovation and restructuring. That's not going to stop China's GDP from, say, surpassing ours probably in the next 30 years, but it could mean that we are still really the lead innovator in this kind of thing. With regard to Latin America, it's important not to exaggerate. When you look at the figures, and Barbara Stallings over here from Brown University has written on this, it's a triangle of sorts, which is to say that, China is now, one point in the triangle, the U.S. and then Latin America. But the U.S. is still very dominant. It is the dominant force in terms of both trade and investment. And the Chinese presence is anything but hegemonic leadership. It is pragmatic, opportunistic interventions in sectors that suit them, and they provide public goods for joint ventures around infrastructure that again relates to being able to get the goods out. These ports they're building, the roads to the ports to the Pacific coast. So that, I think, is an interesting new kind of development model where infrastructure is being provided in ways that it badly needs to be provided in the region by the Chinese. But I think that the U.S., this kind of very ambivalent, ambiguous relationship that the U.S. has had with Latin America in the entire post-war period will continue, where we are the hegemon in the region, but we have abdicated the leadership role, particularly with regard to Latin America.
Just a footnote on the issue of the U.S. I wonder why Latin American are. Why is this question of the leadership of the U.S. is it so important for Latin America? If your hypothesis is truth, which I think I tend to agree with Roberto's, maybe the influence of of the U.S. Can be slightly reduced, but it's going to be the prominent leading force in the Western Hemisphere. But the question is, for Latin America, for me, is why do you have to look outside for leadership and for models? Where is this philosophical culture that Latin America had in the 60s when they invented the cepalinismo, desarrollismo, and all that, where all this drive has gone, especially in a moment where all this equilibrium of the Cold War seems to have been surpassed. So that would be the question that I would put. And just the question of Paolo on the European investment, that's true. I haven't looked very recently at those figures, but it seems to me that it's not a significant departure from the past in which those investments are especially resource-seeking or market-seeking, and definitely they're not going to be the drivers for an export-led push of Latin America into the US, or into the EU markets. So just in pure trade terms, it seems to me that trade relationships are going to go down. Probably Europeans are going to continue to invest in Latin America, but this doesn't make the two regions coming closer. And probably it's going to put Europe on the most difficult part of the agenda, because it will not be particularly willing to open its market to Latin America. They don't have that much to gain in terms of market access, and European will probably push for more regulatory reform or guarantees for investment. So it doesn't seem to me that the political economy of the negotiation put the two regions in a particularly better place to address the issues that they couldn't address in the last 15 years. So, and plus, everybody's looking elsewhere. So I don't really see like this transatlantic alliance be very strategic nor very fashionable, nor I see a lot of people very interested in it. That's what I meant.
Thank you. So, we have one more question, please. Two. Well, two.
Just a comment on this, and it's not on leadership, but it's just on the relationship between, trade relationship between some countries in Latin America and China. And the data shows that there has been a diversification of export partners very clearly, at least for some countries in the past 8 years. For example, in the case of Brazil and Chile, China in 2008 was the main export partner. In the case of Argentina, was number 2, Peru number 2, Venezuela 3, Costa Rica 2, Cuba 5, Uruguay number 4. So definitely there has been, in the past 8 years, especially for those countries that export natural resources, a change in priority in terms of trading partners. Now, I guess for Latin America and the Caribbean region in the future, this at least changing relationship with China poses the challenge of what type of trade would we want to keep doing with China. Is it just inter-regional, inter-industry trade, or maybe try to go more into intra-industry trade, and how Latin American countries could take advantage of some of the value chains and compete with China and Asia in general in different terms. So I guess that's a key question for several countries in the region.
Ramon?
Yes, I think I'm the European here. I'm Raul already. So please.
He's also an European, Paolo.
So,
Yeah, but no, too much time in Latin America, too much time in the US.
He's on exile. Please, let's give, accept an advice. Don't talk about European investment, because European investment does not exist in terms of policy. What exists is German, French, or Italian, or Swedish investment.
Spanish.
Bilateral agreements of investment continue to be signed by member states, not by the European community. So French investment competes with German investment exactly in the same way as with Chinese or the United States investment. European investment in terms of real facts does not exist.
I want to add something related to the comment about the importance of China for the speakers. I think that the idea of regional integration in the past, at least in Mercosur, was to foster intra-industrialization, intra-industry trade. And now we are looking to China, and I think it's very difficult to engage in value chains with China besides natural resources. It is easier to engage in value chains, efficiency-seeking value chains with the U.S. perhaps than with China. So perhaps we are heading in the wrong way, forgetting regional integration and looking to China, because China will buy us essentially natural goods. Argentina's exports to China are completely concentrated in leather and soybeans. So, and we don't see any chances of progressing in the value chain. So, regional integration, the next big idea perhaps could be, let's go back to the regional market to see if we can find opportunities for intra-industry specialization and to get the economies of specialization and scale that we were looking for in the early 90s.
Just a minor comment. I think that you are right, Andres, but I think we should stop talking about Latin America. We talk about Latin America essentially because we are Latin Americans and because we have institutions that deal with Latin America. But what we have is a very heterogeneous region, and I don't see. I see that we can look for intra-industry trade and specialization in the southern cone. I see Central America and Mexico in a completely different game. So when we think about regional integration in Latin America, I think that we must think about very different things within that that coherent whole. That's it. Incoherent.
I just want to say something about the increasing trade ties, especially between China and Latin America. They're impressive, as China's trade ties are exploding with everybody, asymmetrically in many cases. But I think that if we look, I just saw a really good presentation at my university on China's outward foreign direct investment, and its foreign direct investment in Latin America. Figures are a little, fuzzy as usual, but it's estimated that it's around 70 million, but the bulk of that is, in the Cayman Islands or sitting in, offshore accounts. So the FDI is negligible. The trade is impressive. We just heard about Argentine soybeans, but we also saw a shocking plummet in demand for those soybeans in the wake of the crisis. And Argentina has been hit fairly hard by the crisis because of some of the things that Roberto pointed to in his presentation, reverting to past policy practices and this sort of thing. So I think that the China trade relationship with Latin America is here to stay. I'm not sure it can be as compelling as it has been during this amazing commodity boom in the 2000s. But I'm not sure that we can count on it to the extent that Latin Americans can indeed, or the countries can indeed, count on accessing the U.S. market for goods other than just natural resources.
Paola?
I would come back and make a very simple point. If one look at Latin America, trade openness is quite modest. If one look at the figures that Roberto was presenting, if one look at the tariff barriers in a few years, it's going to be 0.3%, 0.5%. So there's a problem. And I think the biggest problem in terms of what is preventing Latin America to export more, be it in a formal regional agreement or not, is other costs, regulatory costs, transport costs. So this is really what is cornering Latin America in a bad place of the world economy. We don't have comparative advantages to sell to China, as Andres was saying. We have a hard time getting into the U.S. or European market, and we can't agree among ourselves because, as a concept, we don't exist. But there are a lot of things that are very very important. Regulatory barriers, transport costs that can help, in fact, to have a better export performance.
Can I say one more thing? Yeah. I just want to make one more follow-on comment about competitive liberalization because, what I see really happening because of the U.S. offer for bilateral FTAs, it's no coincidence that the small states, right, CAFTA DR, Peru, Chile, have basically, by signing on to these FTAs and agreeing to a deep liberalization of the services and investment, the new trade agenda, they basically agreed to import the U.S. regulatory structure, right? That's what this is all about. So the real risk of the spaghetti bowl for me is the deepening and institutionalization of U.S. regulatory standards in all of Central America, Mexico, going down now to Peru and Chile, and then there's the rest of the region, right, that's kind of moving to its own beat in different ways. I think that's the challenge that we're looking at, and it really isn't clear what kind of services liberalization, for example, that Brazil and Argentina are going to finally agree to.
We have one more question. One last question.
It's Cindy Arnson again. It's more of a comment, I think. I think China is going to be sort of the elephant in the room throughout the day. But I'd like to challenge something that Carol said when you talked about Chinese investment in infrastructure being very important for, the development of infrastructure in Latin America. It seems to me that the building of roads and ports to facilitate exports of commodities to the Chinese market is the pattern of the 16th century. And I was just wondering whether, even though the investment of China is less than the actual trade in terms of its importance for Latin American economies, if there is a corresponding attempt within Latin America to find ways to channel Chinese interest in Latin America in ways that support overall development strategies and not simply the servicing of the Chinese economy.
Well, if please be.
I'm going to be very short.
No. Well, we have time for the.
Okay.
These are the last two questions.
Very short. Putting a little bit of some pessimistic arguments about the new trade agenda with U.S. and the China trade. First, the new trade agenda with U.S. many times incorporates very protectionist policy in terms of, property rights, etc. So many times it's just a cost that countries like Chile and Peru are paying. It's not that they want to do that. I mean, it's an imposition, and you had to wait gain from trade access with losses from this kind of protectionist policy on terms of property rights, etc. And second, on China thing, yes, China has been very, very aggressive in terms of reaching out our markets, and in many times is more. The way to do things is more depredatory than, let's say, England in the 18th century. In the sense, the only thing they want is the mineral product. Okay, so they don't care about, sort of. I would say spillovers in terms of manufacturing, etc. What Andres was saying. So it depends on our countries to negotiate with these guys in a way that to be sure that these new markets help us to develop some kind of local, industries or local or spillovers that makes growth more sustainable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations to both speakers. My question might be very broad, but I would anyway, in any case, appreciate any of both speakers elaborate on this. To what extent this scenario in integration and trade in Latin America, and both models, to put it in a way, those followed by Argentina and Brazil on one hand, and Peru and Chile on the other, are explained by the role of agriculture and the fact that agriculture is so poorly integrated in multilateral trade disciplines. Thank you.
Any reaction from the...
Well, just to build, I think that the two last comments by Pablo and by you, they raise one issue that is very important. That this North-South agreement are inherently asymmetric. They are asymmetric not only in terms of trade disciplines, but they are asymmetric in terms of market access, because the way in which they treat sensitive sectors is very different. It depends whether the sensitive sector is on the agenda of the northern country or the southern country. So, of course, Argentina and Brazil have a very strong offensive interests in agriculture, and not much liberalization is being offered, and not much harmonization of domestic regulations is being offered, particularly subsidies in the agricultural chapter in US or EU FTAs, and that's a structural problem, to barrier to an agreement. However, Brazil and Argentina are not playing the same game, and I think that we have to keep in mind that we have two different kind of strategic views on how to relate to the international trading system that were shown very clearly in the differences between Argentina and Brazil in the last Doha package. Brazil was ready to go ahead, at least that it was. It said Argentina was not ready to go ahead, and it was not ready to go ahead, not because trade liberalization in agriculture was very limited, which it was, but because Argentina had no interest in any kind of progress or deal, basically because it was stuck in a domestic in a domestic knot. So again, I go back to my heterogeneity point, which doesn't clarify very much, but at least shows where it's worthwhile to put a bit more of attention.
I want to just respond to...
Yes.
Come on, let's turn the cell phones off, please. This is Professor and me talking. I want to just these two comments here, but for example, I think the protectionism, the intellectual property, the timeline on the patents, the timeline on the data for when it can be released, and these sorts of things were a big, big point of contention in the Peruvian case. And listen, it's not to say that these deals are perfect deals, but they made some deals with the devil in the process of getting guaranteed access to the U.S. market. The Peruvians, for example, I was shocked that the telecom sector, U.S. telecom service providers can now buy and sell used telecom equipment in the Peruvian market. I mean, it's going to basically just, put the end of any sort of domestic telecom market with regard to cell phone use and that sort of thing. So, I mean, in a sense, there are aspects of these agreements that are questionable. On the other hand, there seems to be the signal that is sent, the old-fashioned signaling, right, that seems to have been sent by the signing of the U.S. agreement especially, has been, I believe, a big impulse for some of this investment, at least coming into Peru. And Chile's seen big jumps in investment. So I do think that you have to... I don't like these patent regulations. I thought they were very unfair. I think telecom in Peru is a disaster. But I do think that the signal that's been sent, on balance, outweighs some of the deals that were made with the devil. Just Cindy's comment. I think that big differences between the 16th century now with regard to the provision of infrastructure. My understanding, this road that's going to go from, two roads that are going to go, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, crossing through wherever, partly the Amazon. These aren't exclusive, public goods. These are public goods, and that they'll be open to use for all, and that, the Chinese are paying concessions and whatnot. So, I mean, let's tell it like it is. They want the resources, and they'll do what they can to get it. The question is, can other producers, can there be multiplier effects in terms of other producers in the region, especially in Brazil, benefiting from this incredible opportunity to access the Pacific waterways and, perhaps integrate more closely into an intra-industry trade network with China. One of the ironies, I read a paper recently, but it was by one of my students, so I'm not sure as to the claim, but he's smart, but I'm not sure as to the claim, and saying that perhaps it isn't going to happen anytime soon, but probably one of the more beneficial free trade agreements could be Brazil-China, because Brazil's the one country that I do think could really thrive in this intra-industry, chain of production supplier network that China, is such a hub for in Asia. The others, I think we've reached agreement that this kind of old-fashioned comparative advantage relationship that they have with China isn't going to change. I don't see it changing.
Paolo, do you have some? No? Well, thank you. Well, we are a really Latin American seminar because we are out of schedule by 30 minutes. So we have a very short coffee break, 5 minutes, and then we return for the second session.